Thank you so much, Jeannie. Well, we are very excited about moving forward with a concrete roadmap to improve the urban adaptation finance landscape. A concrete idea came up after this session, and I think that's the perfect way to move on into our wrap-up session of these 2 fantastic days of discussion about this topic. So we're going to talk about innovation now. We're going to talk about the future of urban adaptation finance. And for that, we have an amazing group of speakers. We thank you so much for joining. We have Kathy Botham McLeod, who's the Senior Vice President of the Atlantic Council and the Director of the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center. We have with us James Alexander, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the UK Sustainable Investment and Finance Association. We have Seth Schultz, who's the CEO of the Resilience Rising. And we have Jonathan Maxwell, who's the CEO of Sustainable Development Capital. Thank you so much for being with us today. So we want to hear from you about exciting things going on around the world on this topic. And we know that you are working on many of them. So tell us about that. Tell us about how you see the future of urban adaptation finance and how can we promote a better landscape for cities in this regard. Let's start with you, Kathy. Thank you so much for joining.
Nice to be here with everyone. And as you may notice, Jorge and I just switched seats. We're at a climate finance event right now and having this conversation. And this couldn't be more topical, more urgent. I would say the key words are urgency and acceleration. We have mostly what we need, and we need to start shoving capital into these projects and into what we know will sustain and grow the communities and the job prospects and the safety and health of communities, particularly urban and most vulnerable. And just in quick introduction, I am the director of the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center. We call it Arsht for short. And our mission is to build the capacity for individual and community resilience in the face of climate impacts. We've set a goal of reaching 1 billion people with resilient solutions to climate impacts by 2030. And so we're in a hurry, and we can't do it alone. And we have so many great partners, and many of them have been a part of today's conversation. And Mauricio Rodas is certainly one of them. So lots of kudos to the leadership of Mauricio for his commitment and understanding of how critical this rush to adaptation finance is. What in terms of innovation, there's one thing that keeps coming up, and that's taxonomy. And I want to put on the table that a taxonomy has been created and adopted in the EU taxonomy for sustainable activities. And so I have an idea. There's a question that will come up about what kind of quick research needs to be done. And I think that taxonomy needs to be accessible, translated, interpreted in every which way for everybody to have an understanding. So we're working from the same framework. Secondly, I heard Jorge mention this. We believe that insurance as an approach has a strong role to play in financing urban adaptation and seeing it for all the things it we have a discussion today about insurance as how we govern risk. It's not always a commercial product, it's an approach. And so insurance at the micro level for the informal sector at the mezzanine level, big parametric policies for sovereign level risk, all of those things come together. And insurance, for every percentage of insurance increase in premia, you see a direct correlation of growth in GDP of a country. And I would guess the same for a city. We've need to look at the city-specific data, but the idea of insurance as the as more than, it is so much more than products that we buy to transfer our risk. And so that's an important piece. And I heard some of what Jerome was saying, and the idea of innovation insurance is rich. There's lots of opportunity there. And then the role of technology and the way technology interfaces with the way we understand risk. And we're focused on extreme heat, as I think you've heard from others, and the idea that technology, gaming, apps, the way that people get information and understand what they need to do to protect themselves, you know, as we see, as I hope we'll see, increase in capital deployed into adaptation, we'll still see what we have now, which is 30 years of these temperatures and the 10 years more that we agreed to burn and invest in burning fossil fuels from the Glasgow climate meeting. So more is coming. And so how do we use the technology? And we are looking at specifically and partnered with the Red Cross Global Disaster Preparedness Center to use an app that's already there to give heat health specific information that's actionable for people in cities. We also are looking at the use of, and now I'm going to use the combined insurance and finance and technology, a pre-event financing and risk transfer, and we'll be piloting insurance that is a parametric that triggers on the forecast. So forecast-based parametrics for getting money into the treasury of a city to be able to identify people most at risk and find them and provide what they need, if that's you know, cooling or to be going into another, you know, to a cool place, or letting them know that they can turn their air on if they think they can't afford it, and covering that, all sorts of policies that do this. And so, Mauricio, I know we want to have a conversation, and so let me stop there. But the beauty of the climate adaptation finance conversation is that we can do this. There are lots of things we can't do, and it's very easy to be overwhelmed by the climate crisis, but these are evidence-based interventions. We know what they are. And so if we use the same taxonomy, I think we need to put use of proceeds, ring fencing around the use of parametric payouts. And we've not done that yet. And I think we need multi-year contracts. But I don't want to get it all out in the first intervention. So let me turn it over to my esteemed co-panelists and see where we go. But it's an exciting time, but the urgency just couldn't be greater.
Thank you so much, Kathy. That was a fantastic way to begin this session and this discussion. Now I would like to turn it over to James. I mean, everybody knows you because you are an innovative and disruptive thinker on the issue of climate finance. So please give us a perspective of how you see the current urban adaptation finance landscape.
Mauricio, you're too kind. Thank you very much. And it's nice to be in a room full of disruptive thinkers, and I think that's what we need in this space quite urgently. Very quick intro. I'm James Alexander, Chief Executive of UK SIF. We bring together the financial services industry in the UK to drive forward sustainability in finance and investment. We have about 10 trillion pounds of assets. That's about $13 trillion of assets across our membership. But that's kind of partly my current job. Really why I'm really here, I suppose, is my previous role, which was leading the city finance program at C40 cities, which I did for 7 years. Worked with Seth, worked with Lolita, worked with other people on this call, and of course with you, Mauricio, and set up the city finance program, set up the C40 cities finance facility, which was structuring transactions, and did a lot of work engaging with cities on their financial challenges. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of some of the challenges as I've seen them over the last 7 or 8 years, and of course with some additional reflections from where I am right now. And I'm glad Kathy mentioned the green taxonomy. I'm actually on the UK government working group creating the UK's green taxonomy. and we're thinking quite carefully about how adaptation is included in there. And one of the key features of a taxonomy is do no significant harm. And so when you're doing a resilience program, you also have to think about, well, actually, when you're doing starting off a mitigation program, you have to think about, am I doing any significant harm to other things, including to the broader resilience of the city, the country, the place, individuals. Likewise, if you're doing a resilience program or an adaptation program, are you doing significant harm to other objectives? And there is a scenario, often quite a lot of resilience programs do quite a lot of harm to biodiversity, waterways and other things, but also release a huge amount of emissions potentially. We've got to balance these things up. But I just wanted to throw that in there. The main kind of point I want to make is, obviously, I'm sure you've discussed how much risk cities are at. We are in the middle of this great global experiment of moving huge chunks of the population into some of the most risky areas that we can put them, and partly because the reason why cities are where cities are is because of their access to natural resources. Unfortunately, it's those natural resources that makes them now so vulnerable. I dare say Seth is going to talk a lot more about that than I will, but I think every city is now reporting that they are seeing the negative impacts of climate change, and that was one of the big turning points when I was at C40, when people were sort of started off by seeing climate change as a long distance horizon thing, and very gradually, mayor by mayor, started saying, "Oh God, we're seeing this now. We're seeing it happening now. This is scary." And I think that's we're in a huge shift there. So what are we seeing cities doing? Well, we've worked on projects in Durban where the city was trying to rehabilitate their stormwater stream system. Worked on a similar project in Accra, in Ghana. And I think one of the big reflections that I have there is fundamentally that if there is no budget line for maintenance, there's almost no point in building the project in the first place. We have seen so many city projects that exist that should work, that have been paid for, but have not been maintained, and so they don't serve their purpose. And it drives me absolutely crazy to see budget lines cut for good infrastructure that's actually performing a protective function, because it's easy to cut them, because nobody notices it doesn't work until the crisis happens, the flood happens or whatever. There's also an additional challenge, particularly for water-based resilience programs, and I work in Jakarta on this, in terms of waste management, particularly plastic management, is a huge problem for urban water-based challenges. I was doing a scoping exercise of a project in Jakarta, and we were on the river in a boat, and the engine on the boat kept cutting out, and guys had to go with machetes to cut the plastic off of the propeller that had caused the boat to cut out. That's how serious the plastic problem was in the waterways there, and it meant that any type of stormwater program just got immediately clogged with plastic. And so you can't just solve resilience without thinking about the holistic system, particularly the waste system. And then the other thing that a lot of cities were thinking about was, how do we measure the success of a resilience program or an adaptation program, and what do we judge a good investment to be? And of course, the classic way of thinking about investment is, well, what sort of assets does it protect? That in some cities could just be one street could be worth more in terms of book assets than an entire, particularly informal district. So we've got to start thinking, I think, very differently about what is it that we're protecting and how are we protecting it, and looking at people rather than looking necessarily at assets. And so I think I just want to go into a few thoughts about some of the financing challenges that cities are seeing. And so there's the generic financing challenge that cities have, which is, of course, often their creditworthiness. We hear a lot about talking about creditworthiness of cities. And it's right that we're worried about it. Cities, broadly speaking, have got three core creditworthiness challenges they need to address. And sadly, they're not rocket science. The first is properly collecting the own source revenue that they're due. So many cities just don't take in the tax that they're supposed to take in. And they could transform their finances overnight without having to change a single law by just collecting the tax that they're supposed to collect. Getting their finances under control is another key challenge. And having long-term political I guess the long-term political ability to or willingness to keep the finances under control. And it's of course very tempting in a short-term mayoral electoral cycle to think, well, we can just spend more now, we need to get this thing done. Well, they've got to have, if you want to keep your credit worthiness, then you need to do that. But also the final challenge is cities don't have any track record of borrowing or paying back. And one of the problems is that actually all the big, nice, juicy projects are taken by the MDBs. And so there's almost no capital kind of market emerging emerging, own private market emerging for these big juicy infrastructure projects, which they need as anchors. And then what happens is the MDB, the counterparty, is the national government, so the city's not involved, and so the city still then has no track record of borrowing and paying back. But so you might think that it would be therefore top priority to fix city creditworthiness, but I would actually argue that it isn't. And the reason why is because sadly, it's very hard to become a top political priority. No mayor ever put on their manifesto, and Mauricio, you can maybe correct me if I'm wrong on this, but no mayor put on their manifesto, my top priority for this election is to get the city's creditworthiness, signed off, and we get a credit rating. I would love if that were the case, but it's not. That's not how this thing works. And so, we did a lot of work with city finance officers and CFOs and helping them to figure out why they're not creditworthy and to figure out what they can do about it. They went back to their city with great plans and great ambitions, and then 6 months later nothing had happened. And the reason why? Because the pressing day-to-day issues take over. And so what we need to think about is looking at creditworthiness as a component of achieving a specific objective. And so gradually, bit by bit, building the city's creditworthiness, partly by successful, showing track record of successful transactions, and partly by, making it a priority in order to deliver a specific project. And that's what we were starting to work on with the city's finance facility. Incidentally, that problem that we were trying to solve there still exists and needs to be massively ramped up in scale, which is that cities have got an idea of what they want to do, but lack the internal capacity to structure the transaction to get the financing underway. And so you've got cities that stop here, and you've got financial counterparts that stop here, and there's this huge gulf in the middle of project preparation to get a transaction to the point that people will invest in it. And that was the entire point of the C40 Cities Finance Facility. Just a few other things I wanted to very quickly mention. We've got a challenge with the private sector in particular that I think we all need to work on. Jonathan, I'd be really keen on your thoughts on this, because my understanding of where the private sector was at from a city's perspective is nobody understood what the projects were from a technical perspective. Certainly, a lot of the projects that needed to be done, there wasn't a track, that understanding, that inherent understanding of, oh yeah, we've done 10 of these projects before. We can do this with our eyes closed because we understand the technology. That's not the way it was. Nobody understands the specific individual powers that each city has, which vary in terms of their ability to borrow, raise capital, how that fits into their legal environment, and so what we find from the banks, the private banks and the other lenders, is they just look at this project that comes on their desk. They see the amount of different due diligence challenges that there are, and it just goes into the too hard pile, and it will stay there forever. And the thing that will change that is by starting to highlight and promote and demonstrate, first of all, the huge scale of projects that are out there. So it's actually worth it. It is worth your financial services firm getting a team together to understand this stuff, because there's going to be huge amounts of deals at the end of it if you play it right. HSBC did a pretty nice job of that when it came to urban bus financing, incidentally. The second thing we need to do is to start, I think someone mentioned on the previous panel, to start actually trying to standardize these things a bit more, and to start talking about, well, how can we standardize a little bit the powers that cities have got to around financing, and also the structuring the transactions, which we were trying to do in South Africa. We were doing one storm project in Durban and seeing if we could roll that out to multiple other cities across South Africa using the same model. We also have a huge problem of development banks, some of you may know that I wrote a paper looking at the need for a development bank that works specifically for cities. We called it the Green Cities Development Bank, and the reason why is because the system that we are in requires that development banks work only with national governments as counterparties. That is the broad system that they operate to. That's their broad constitutional system. And our analysis is that's not going to change anytime soon. And the reason why is because it's not in any of the decision makers' interest to change that system. And so we think that the best way to do it is not to try and share out that pie that the MDBs have, but actually to just create an entirely different pie over here that is working directly with cities, supporting city projects, actively trying to crowd in private capital, actively focusing on the things that are just across the line of what's too hard, and trying to move that too hard line further over, changing the types of projects it works on each time. So I think there's a huge challenge there. And I think one of the key solutions would be to create a development bank for cities. And I'm still, you know, despite the fact that I've had many conversations with many governments about, you know, Western governments about putting it into place, global North government, sorry, I should say, about putting it into place. We're still not there yet, but I think there's a piece of work that we could usefully do together to try and think about how we can scope that one step further. Mauricio, I've got so much more I could probably say, but I'm gonna stop there and continue in a minute.
No, thank you so much, James. We know you have a lot to say. I mean, we are eager to keep hearing from you during the next round. And it's great that you brought up the idea of creating this cities green development bank as a direct mechanism to support cities financially, because in the previous session we were discussing exactly about that, about the need to create something new, something disruptive that could ensure that cities have proper access to finance to develop climate-related projects. Thank you so much for that, James. Now let me turn it over to Seth. Seth, you have just started a new endeavor called Resilience Raising with a very innovative approach that you shared with us. So can you please tell us more about this, and why do you think that approach is particularly relevant to contribute to urban adaptation?
Yeah, thanks, Mauricio, and hello, everyone. It is fabulous to see so many good friends and colleagues, and it's been great kind of tuning in and listening throughout the last day and a half. And Mauricio, when you asked me to talk about Resilience Rising, I was a little hesitant. I was like, well, that's awfully self-serving, talk about my own organization. But I completely understand now, given the conversation, why, and it's very actually motivating to hear everything that's been said, articulated, particularly picking up on some comments that Ben from the last group just made. You know, after spending 10, 12 years in the space as a disruptor of trying to think through what we need to do, it's been really difficult to grapple through and to figure out how we can really move forward resilience. I mean, it just doesn't keep working. It's behind, not just on this finance piece. What I'm about to say is going to come from a little bit of a different angle, because, you know, we keep talking about shifting trillions and we've got this money, and some of the other points that James was just making, like there is a, you know, pot of gold at the end of this rainbow if you can uncover it in some steps. But there's a lot of other pieces missing in between that keep holding us back on resilience. As a small example, you know, when we're talking about capacity building and in places that need it, and we're talking about moving the trillions of dollars to create the low carbon and resilient infrastructure that we need. I did a little calculation last year. I was actually talking to Jeff Sachs about it about 6 months ago. If you were to calculate the money that's necessary to do what's needed in Africa alone, you need 10 million new engineers between now and 2050. 10 million engineers. If you look at the number of people that are graduating globally, you're not even anywhere near this number. So there's just some pretty dramatic gaps in terms of us. Like, you cannot just throw money at this problem. It will not solve it. There's some really fundamental issues and challenges that go along with it. So as we've been thinking about this for the last couple of years, at an organization I've been working with called Resilience Rising, you know, recognizing that, yes, this is the most decisive decade in human history. Yes, the world is changing in fundamental ways, but, you know, what is this? You know, underpinning our society, we have technological, human, and ecological systems, right? And they're becoming increasingly more interdependent. We also know they're becoming more and more fragile due to fragmented governance and some of the other things we've been talking about, with an insufficient investment, and now are operating increasingly, this is a key for us, in an uncertain future. So whether you're talking about engineering or energy systems or financial systems, the level of uncertainty facing us now is a major problem that just there is not enough discussion around. So what we did after a couple of years of grappling with this is we've just launched in January an organization called Resilience Rising. And it's a consortium. So it's a very kind of ambitious new approach in the NGO space, I believe. And the idea is to accelerate global systemic transformation by convening essential communities of practice, which I'll talk about in a little bit, to collectively address these major challenges and to improve the resilience of core global systems, right? Through a number of mechanisms that everybody's familiar with: capacity building, thought leadership, advancing you know, advocacy for change. But really the goal here is systemic resilience to become a norm with regards to how we build out this net zero future. So how do you mainstream this activity? Yes, it's going to require lots of bold and courageous action to do this, and across so many of the things we talked about: financing, planning, designing, and building. But really, and picking up again on previous conversations, we must rethink the solutions that are the most fundamental questions that are driving our prosperity, security, and well-being. So this isn't bolt-on. I think we need a more aggressive and transformational approach about how we're doing this. I do not think we're going to be able to build bolt-on in many ways what we need to be able to do in the next 10 years. This is going to require, I think, Mauricio, a shift in leadership approach and human behavior to successfully navigate these challenges to get to the outcome that we want now and into the future. And I think it's increasingly, right, we've talked about what, cities and city networks, and we've talked about the infrastructure hub, we've talked about all these different kind of things. We're increasingly believing that there are these key communities of practice that are essential to transform together. And that part of the model of operation that we have in the NGO system of working in silos or working within kind of organizations that we understand, it's siloed and it's broken apart. And as you change one part of the system, it has impacts on the other. And if you don't do that in step change, you're going to keep going. We think this is why we haven't had the same strides forward on the resilience side that have been made more on the mitigation side more recently. So with this understanding, we've created this common vision with Resilience Rising in a consortium of organizations that will collectively work within these communities of practice in order to advance what we need. So part of why I kind of understanding these different communities of practice, it came out of research that we've done in understanding the resilience kind of value chain. And the communities of practice that I want to mention are engineers, business innovators, infrastructure owners and operators, future leaders, policymakers at all three levels of government, and investors. And the idea is that by having an organization, an NGO, we're operating as a consortium, so a hybrid more like a holding company in the for-profit community, but with a mission-driven NGO, we can ultimately harness these 6 different communities of practice in terms of one dedicated legal entity to drive the resilient outcomes that we want. So what we've been doing over the last 2 years is brokering and collecting this consortium. So out of these 6 communities that I practice, I mentioned it launched in January. We've got 4. So we've got the world's largest coalition of engineers now, which is ICSE. We've got the world's largest coalition of businesses, which is Resilience First. We've got owners, operators, and the largest network of ports and cities, which is navigating a changing climate. And then we're also in conversations with 2 additional organizations I can't talk about yet, but hopefully we'll be on board by the end of the year. And through this, we've actually legally combined these 4 different organizations. They all have separate boards. They all have separate strategies. They all have separate funding, but we've turned tribalism on its head. So these communities of practice are within themselves. So it's engineers talking to engineers, businesses talking to engineers, but we've created an executive leadership team of the CEOs of each of these so that they're all pulling in the same direction. And kind of how I refer to that is moving away from kind of little C collaboration to big C collaboration. So they all have their own mandate, they all have their own friction, but by putting them into one legal entity, we've decreased, or rather increased the efficiency, decreased the overhead. We can move staff and money between different NGOs. And the idea is, how do we scale organizations tackling resilience within 6 years? Then after starting 7 different businesses and NGOs in the last 10 years, I can tell you it takes time. There's no shortcut to doing it. So how can you create a mechanism that can take impassioned leaders in the key communities of practice and rapidly get them to scale in lockstep? And that's what we've done with Resilience Rising and how we've launched it. Really exciting about it. And I could also kind of share more, Marisa, with some of the things that we're seeing in the land evolving in the NGO space with regards to adaptation and resilience. Also kind of what we've seen work in developing and instilling resilience in projects. But I'll leave it for there now. But I just wanted to kind of pick up on this idea of how important it is to create new organizational structures, innovative approaches on how we're going to do this. And if we don't figure out how to do this together in coordination, it's not going to work. I mean, simply put, as Kathy and others have said, we've got some daunting issues. And I think it's becoming clearer and clearer that no one can solve these. So you've got to do it in collaboration. How do you create the space that allows the friction and the intensity of the community-driven bias to emerge, but to also learn and compromise in lockstep? I don't know if we have all the solutions, but we're definitely trialing a very new radical approach in what we're doing with these organizations in Resilience Rising. So I'll leave it there, Mauricio, hand back to you, but really looking forward to picking up on the discussion, the dialogue, because I think if we don't figure out how to motivate these key communities of practice, doesn't matter how much money is available, it's not going to work.
you so much said. Yes, partnerships, coordination, collaboration is absolutely key, and so we really appreciate you shared the vision behind the approach that you are taking right now with this new initiative. Let me now hand it over to Jonathan. So Jonathan, you will provide us with the very interesting perspective from the private sector in terms of the kind of innovations that could be implemented for fostering urban adaptation. How do you see the future of urban adaptation finance? You're on mute.
I was just saying thank you so much for inviting me to answer the question for you. So I hope I can come somewhere close to previous speakers in making a contribution. I think we've made a start at answering your question, and I think the point about demonstration is really important. I think that being able to sort of point at what works and what success looks like, I think, is one of the first steps. And we're on the first step of making those first steps. We've made allocations and commitments to about $2 billion worth of projects now across Europe and the United States that deliver resource efficiency. Our company is called Sustainable Development Capital. With sustainable development for us means resource efficiency, and resource efficiency, the largest and most valuable component of that so far from an investment perspective, has been around energy, and for us, energy efficiency. So demonstrating sort of what success looks like, I think, is an important first step. We've now got about 55,000 properties in mostly in urban environments that we have had the opportunity to help a combination of mitigate and adapt to environmental and climate problems. We provide lower carbon, lower cost, more reliable, more resilient energy solutions to those counterparties, and also deal with other resources like energy, water, waste, as well as transport. So I mean, the first point I would like to make, just kind of echoing other panelists, is the power of demonstration and trying to find out what works and then replicate. I think I also sort of echoed Jonathan's earlier comments about development, because development, I think, is a huge gap. I'd also echo the problem with development banks, because I wrote a paper actually 12 years ago with the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative, specifically on the funding gap, ironically, the funding gap of development when it comes to development banks. Relatively little, less than 5% of capital from development banks went into actual development. Most money goes into construction. And I think I really echo the points made earlier on about the importance of development. The dirty secret really for cities and getting things done, in my experience, though, comes down to things like procurement. So even if we know what good looks like, and even if we can develop projects, actually going through the procurement timetables and processes and the life cycle for, at least in the public sector, municipalities, universities, schools, and hospitals, there is this does need to be thought through, streamlined up front. I think one of the ways in which infrastructure finance flowed so powerfully in Europe, North America, and other markets has been set a procurement system where a major project is bid out by the public sector. The problem with the climate and environmental finance is that the projects are usually developed from ground up, and then I think they find it very difficult to get on the other side of projects find it very difficult to get sponsors really in the public sector, and then to go through procurement processes. So I think that's a big part of streamlining. I think I very much echo the other points, and I'm saying this as an investor and financier, very much echo the other points made here today about skills and community engagement. So we have projects in urban environments, some more disadvantaged urban environments, where a lot of the success of a major project over a period of time that we would finance, and Lillian Jackson, who's on the line, who joined us from New York Mayor's Office as the climate diplomat for New York, and now is very actively engaged with us on the ground. I think we both recognize how challenging it is to ensure that projects are correctly staffed and skilled, and the importance of in a local community or in an urban environment, having the connection between the project and the workforce, the community, and making your project and your place, I think attractive for highly skilled people to come and work, and in order to train people up. So in fact, even engagement with local universities, I think these things are massively underestimated in terms of long-term investment and financing. I think part of that's a sort of a link. I've got 4 more points, I'll be quick, but the next link I would make, actually linked to education, is the idea of communication. I think skills links to education. Education, I think, then helps all levels. It helps everybody from the public sector to the private sector, to the financial community, to the workforce. Indeed, one of the things that I've seen work in urban environments previously has been the creation, I've done it myself in London, of creating something called it's like an Institute for Sustainability, and actually trying to bring multiple stakeholders together to promote the development of projects, particularly in the urban environment, because these are multiple stakeholder projects. You need consortia, clients in the public sector or the private sector, delivery partners, construction, operational firms, financiers like myself, and those consortia need to be able to come together to deliver a major project in an urban environment, whether it's adaptation or mitigation. Why are cities so important? Well, most people live there, most energy and resources are consumed there. It's going to be the place where the climate and, frankly, resource battles are fought globally. And they're also, I think, the best possible example about how we need to think different as a global political and financial community, because we so often, when it comes to resources, and particularly the energy sector, people think about the grid, large wind farms, solar parks, centralized energy systems. Cities are a fantastic demonstration of the fact that actually the problem that you're trying to solve are buildings, industry, and transport. That's 70% of the world's energy use is in buildings, industry, and transport. The epicenter, almost all of that activity is in cities. That's the problem. Buildings in Europe use 40% of Europe's energy, 40. And frankly, similar for the rest of the resources. Industry in and around urban environments was extremely important, and transport, as we probably know, and I won't go on with all the statistics the esteemed participants today will be familiar with, but just if you tolerate me on transport for 1 second, and this is important from adaptation, more people are dying from premature lung disease in town than they are from road traffic accidents. And more people die from road traffic accidents than they do from war, terrorism, and murder put together.
Thank you so much. Sorry, no, go ahead.
No, so anyway, my point being, air pollution in town is really important. So, as part of adaptation to climate and electrification, so I think the last 2 points I'd make in terms of a financing gap, we've talked about development, procurement, skills, focus around buildings, industry, and transport, stakeholders. The last sort of point, 2 points I'd make, one of which is around, again, to touch on with the points raised earlier, credit. Credit problems are solvable. There are credit guarantees. There have been fantastic deals. I've done fantastic deals where we're able to source credit guarantees to provide the perceived, if not real, risk of credit default. And I think that has a much, much larger role to play. In fact, the World Bank obviously has had MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, as a division for many years. But the application of credit guarantees, I think, is one of the most transformative potential financial instruments available in the sector. There have been some good and bad examples of it, but the good side, for example, of the PACE, the Property Assessed Clean Energy System, there have been some bad sides, but the good side is probably one of the best examples of pure play credit enhancement I've ever seen. And then the last point I'd make very finally on about urban resilience, I think this is now taking on a very different dimension. We've seen climate, the biggest impact of weather and climate in the US from our perspective as an investor has been knocking cities, regions off the grid, like Texas in February last year, Louisiana in the summer last year, Manhattan in 2012 in Superstorm Sandy, when I started to invest in urban adaptation solutions. So severe weather events has created energy and other resource insecurity, and resilience has really been what's driven, I think, urban adaptation investment from our perspective in the US for the last decade. we're now facing huge resilience problems here in Europe, not just because of the weather, not just because of the climate, but because of geopolitics and human migration here in this part of the world. And I think that's why resource efficiency, investing in adaptation solution is taking on a completely new dimension. So those are my thoughts that I can offer as a financial investor. The last thing I would say is that capital markets are very large, very liquid, and very motivated to make investments in the ESG and sustainability space. So I think the good news here is that there is no lack of availability of capital. I think the real problem is threading the needle with that capital, making sure it can get to the right places, and most importantly, creating the projects. And the ingredients and problems I've laid out today, I hope are helpful.
Thanks so much, Jonathan, for those very insightful remarks, and particularly for your optimism regarding the role of the capital markets in building urban adaptation. Thank you so much. Let me go back to Kathy. Kathy, the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center in less than 3 years have been able to very successfully address resilience building with an innovative approach. And particularly, it has been focusing on extreme heat in cities, how it is affecting urban population around the world. Could you please, on the one hand, comment about this work, and also, given your experience regarding innovative finance, can you talk about different projects that you have led in the past on this field, particularly the one that I found really fascinating on the Mexican Riviera, Mayan Riviera, to build adaptation? Please, Kathy.
Hi there. Can you hear me? Am
Yes.
I? Oh, good. Okay. Yes. So I love the range of what innovation, how we've touched on